welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. I just recorded a podcast yesterday, in fact, and we published it today with Drummond Reed. And lots of the conversation with him was about creating a trust spanning protocol, which a lot of the architectural requirements for this that he was describing, said about 70% of them sit on layer 2 of the trust over IP stack. Would be curious in leading into our conversation today, talking about AnonCreds. AnonCreds seems like it's a good specification for layer 3 of the trust over IP stack. Would you mind maybe just describing for listeners, if we just take that lens of focusing on kind of that third layer and just talking a little bit about credential types and what these are and why they're important, maybe just an introduction to credential types in general.
So as you mentioned, credentials live at the trust over IP layer 3, and they implement what is commonly called the trust triangle. An issuer does some sort of verification of another entity and then makes a decision to issue a credential with certain information to a holder. The idea is that is a transaction that happens at a point in time. The holder now has the credential in their possession, independent of the issuer now. And so they can then present it to the verifier, to verifiers as a separate transaction, and they can do that as often as they want. There should be no callback to the issuer when that verification is done. So we eliminate this login with Facebook model where the holder sort of authorizes a connection between the verifier and the issuer. But instead, the holder simply gives a proof of the credential, either the credential itself or the proof of the credential, and passes it on. So that's the trust triangle. There are different styles of credentials. AnonCreds is one. What are commonly referred to as W3C credentials are another, but in fact, a bunch of the work we're doing will certainly merge that technology and that terminology. So we'll call them W3C credentials in this, but it really comes down to the capabilities of the credentials and what they, the semantic use of them. The W3C ones are more precisely a W3C format, a data model, which is all that the W3C standard specifies. And then in that data model is a cryptographic suite that describes how that credential is signed by the issuer and then verified by the verifier.
Are there different types of W3C credentials altogether? And so you mentioned W3C credentials mean it's in a W3C format. Are there different formats that these credentials could be in?
Yeah, so one of the things we're working on right now, and this is actually a very recent thing, is we've realized that there's no reason not to have AnonCreds in a W3C format. A lot of work was done a few years ago in trying to align those, and what I realize now and never understood before was those efforts were trying to accomplish a lot more than simply putting AnonCreds credential or a presentation into W3C format. So what you're going to see very soon is AnonCreds in W3C format, which is going to make the conversation nuanced. And then the other two types are commonly what are called LD signatures and what are commonly called BBS plus signatures. So you'll hear those two. And as far as I know, those are the main ones that are used. LD signatures, basically signing the entire credential and using the JSON LD attributes of the data within the credential to create the signing, the signature. And then BBS Plus allows a similar type thing using the JSON LD, but enables at least the feature of selective disclosure, allowing you to, in a presentation, share only specific attributes of a credential that you hold. So those are the main types and differences between the various ones.
So we've started talking about AnonCreds a little bit. Maybe you could give a history on AnonCreds, how they kind of came about in the digital trust space that we're working in. But
Sure.
just the history of this, and then maybe at the same time just talking a bit about the names AnonCreds for anonymous or anonymized would be interesting to hear a bit.
The history goes back to, as I understand it, some work done, I believe, here in Canada. I may not be right there, but blinded signatures. So it goes back to 70s, blinded signatures. There was a lot of work done in the early 2000s and CNL. And I'm not getting the names exactly right of who CNL are, but they are well known. I'd like to get that nailed down. So we'll put that into the podcast notes. They worked together to come up with the idea of anonymous credentials, using blinded credentials to allow you to do the attributes you get, the capabilities you get from anonymous credentials and OnCreds. So that work was done in the early 2000s. Between then and 2016, I believe there was at least one, maybe two implementations of CL signatures and these capabilities in credentials. ID Mixer is the famous one. Then in 2015, 2016, the group around Evernym and Sovereign worked on the implementation of what we now know as AnonCreds. So they did that implementation in Rust. They put it into the Hyperledger Indy project, made it a core component of that. And so that's what we've been working with. And then over the last few years, we basically continued to work on it. The nice thing about OnCreds is they really just work. They include not just the data model that you get in a W3C credential, but also the interactions between the various parties to enable the privacy protecting capabilities of OnCreds. And that's the one of the reasons why they're so easy to work with. On the one hand, you hear that they use more complex cryptography, which is the CL signatures themselves and some of the zero knowledge proof features. On the other hand, the implementation that was created contains all of the interactions necessary to prepare, issue, hold, request a proof, and prepare and proof and verify that proof. All of those capabilities, the protocols necessary, the processing is all completed. And that is what makes it so AnonCreds so easy to use, and why they've been successful in being used over these last 6 years since they became part of the Indy project, and how they will evolve over the next period of time. And we'll talk about that.
There's a lot of government digital ID programs that have made the decision to go down the route of AnonCreds and the Indy world and so forth. What makes, and you touched on a few properties here, but what really makes AnonCreds very well suited for government use cases?
Yeah.
And a lot of use cases around verified person or digital photo IDs. Why are AnonCreds a good solution for government use cases?
Certainly the governments I'm familiar with and work with in Canada, in Europe, especially some in the States, are very interested in the privacy protecting aspects of that. They all have privacy commissioners that they work with, and they want to provide citizens with things like, what I talked about earlier, with the issuer gives the credential to the holder, a person in this case, and that person then controls it and uses it without having to go back and ask permission from the issuer. They can just share it with verifiers. So that is very good. AnonCreds has the idea of both selective disclosure and what are called predicates, zero knowledge proof predicates, where you can say you are older, based on your date of birth, you can say you are older than 21 without sharing your actual date of birth. So that's very helpful in both minimizing the amount of data a person might share, and in reducing the correlation likelihood across verifiers. You're sharing less information, you're reducing the amount of correlatable information. And then another one that's very key is that AnonCreds goes a long way towards not providing any correlatable information just for the act of sharing a credential, of presenting a proof to a verifier. So there is no added unique identifier for the credential, for the holder, or even for if you're doing revocation, for revocation. So there's a number of techniques that are used, capabilities to eliminate correlatable identifiers that are used, that could be used or are often needed when sharing credentials. Now, you may share correlatable information as part of the attributes you're sharing, but the act of sharing a credential does not result in a correlatable identifier being shared. And so those are all really good aspects of privacy. So from government perspective, if you have to have in a person credential, for example, a correlatable identifier, you're essentially creating a new, what's called in the States, the social security number or the social insurance number in Canada. You're creating a new identifier for a person. And that is a big, big deal for a government. That's creating an identifier for a citizen that is published out, that the government is going to have to stand behind. Well, that's a legislative challenge. So the ability to eliminate those and allow the citizen in the person credential case to just share their name or as they need. Well, that name is out there already. That's okay. But creating a new identifier for a resident or a citizen, that's a much bigger deal.
Would they use existing identifiers? Because the governments have existing identifiers, like the social security number, like you mentioned. Would these be tied in some way to these?
Absolutely, those would be attributes within a credential, and that's okay. As opposed to creating a new identifier just to allow the citizen to be able to share their SSN. They can't use the SSN as the cryptographic unique identifier. So that's where you get into this balance of these identifiers and that challenge that brings. So those are some of the reasons. Just generally, the idea of being able to use a zero knowledge proof and to reduce that data, those are all really positive things that that AnonCreds allows. And when I talk about AnonCreds, currently it's CL signatures, as I mentioned. AnonCreds, I expect to evolve into use other signatures, but retain the capabilities. And I think that's the important part, is the capabilities that are provided by AnonCreds, this non-correlatability, minimizing the data shared. Those are the important aspects of AnonCreds, less so how it gets done, as long as it's a valid way of doing it.
So is reducing the correlation or doing privacy preserving interactions like selective disclosure or ZKP predicates, are these completely separate from the signature side of things? So whether you're using CL or LD or BBS, it's completely separate?
Yes and no. You need specific signatures to enable those features. So for example, CL signatures and BBS plus signatures can both be used for these capabilities. And so, for example, my own expectation for version 2 of AnonCreds is it's likely to use BBS plus signatures because of the cryptographic capabilities of them. As far as I know, you could not use LD signatures for zero knowledge proofs and things like that. So the cryptography just doesn't work for that. So you do need special cryptography for it. But CL signatures is not the only cryptography that works with that.
There's also in the government's use case, if we just focus on the verified person use case, if that's the credential we're talking about, there's certain properties that you want and you don't want. One that you don't want is transferability of credentials. And there's other use cases in there's other use cases with verifiable credentials where let's say it's loyalty points or a ticket or something like that. These are types of things that you could transfer to someone else. They're not necessarily bound to you as a person, and person in this context is person defined by the government. So there are use cases for transferability. There are some for not wanting to transfer and having a digital driver's license or verified person. You probably don't want that to be transferable. Is that something that AnonCreds is able to do versus the W3C credentials that are out there?
Yeah, so from a semantic perspective, that is one of the big differences between W3C style credentials that and actually the W3C spec, and then the OnCreds spec. Now, as I said, we're going to be able to get an OnCreds in W3C format, but the semantics of an OnCreds will not change. And here's the difference. A W3C credential, it declares that an issuer said X about a subject. They made some statement about a subject, and when presented, proof can be given that the data has not been tampered with. W3C actually has in its model, has the picture of the holder in figure 1 of the standard, but does not really talk about the holder much throughout. They talk much more about the subject of the credential. And in fact, in a later figure 5.1, they very expressly say that a VC can be transferred amongst holders. So there is a transferability. And OnCreds says issuer said X, issuer said it to the holder, and with the intention that the holder is the only one that can prove that credential. So the party that was issued the credential is the only one that can prove the credential. And part of that proof is, that the issuer said X, that the data has not been tampered with, but was said to the holder, and they're the ones presenting it. And that added attribute that there's non-transferability of the credential is very important when you talk about a person credential or a credential issued to a business that they have a permit and so on. Absolutely, with W3C credentials, there are ways to bind the, to proof the party presenting the credential. So there are techniques that are, but all of those techniques are outside of the W3C data model, and in fact are not intended, are left to the parties to figure out themselves how to do. And AnonCreds has a very specific way of doing that. And that's, I think, very important certainly in government use cases and in many, many use cases. The verifier needs to know the relationship of the person who's presenting the credential with the credential itself. And the most important relationship is the credential was issued to that person or that organization, that entity.
I guess having that more as a standard in AnonCreds is interesting. We've well, not struggled, but we've done stuff in the past at Northern Block, just building around protocols just because things were either not mature enough yet. You end up doing stuff, and later you realize, oh no, we got to get rid of this because this needs to be standard if we want to move this thing forward. So I don't know if that's the case with maybe some of the W3C credentials. The way it's done today is perhaps it could get in the way of interoperability down the line.
It is because the W3C form is about the data model and not about the interactions, and that's very deliberate. And I'm not. That's not a critique of the W3C. That is very specifically designed, specifically done and intended to be. However, that doesn't make implementation easy. And so AnonCreds, by having all of those interactions defined, having that formal binding of this credential was given to this holder and this holder is now presenting it to a verifier, and being able to, and the verifier knowing that makes it a whole lot easier to implement. A lot more things are already defined before you even start. And that makes it easier to implement.
Does the quote, given the AnonCred was given to this holder, in these use cases, does that assume, I'm assuming there has to be some identity proofing process that's done kind of before this happens, and there needs to be some binding to that. What does that need to fit in?
Switching over to governance, are you? and that's really the governance side of the trust over IP stack. When you're a verifier and you get a presentation that is based on a credential that was issued, what is the issuer actually saying? What identity proofing did they do before they issued the credential? What is their assurance process that they're giving it to the right person, and so on and so forth, or the right holder, whether that be a person, an organization. What is the software involved in that? All of those things are more at the governance layer, some a little bit, somewhat at the technical layer, but they're much more in the governance side of it, which is, what does this proof that I just received from an entity mean? And that's much more a governance question.
Are there use cases where AnonCreds you think are maybe not the right implementation, where maybe you'd want to use a W3C format credential, or is there? I've been repeating this a lot lately. I feel like there's, and you've seen this in our spaces. There's just a lot of tribalism around different implementations, but or even protocols. But at the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of them working together because they serve different use cases. Did you see that as being the case for these different credential types, where you're going to have a mix of different ones based on the different use cases? And then if that's true, are there some use cases that AnonCreds are better? Well, we know which ones they're better for from our discussion, but some they're maybe not, and maybe W3C credentials are better for these.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes down to, and OnCreds are about privacy protections, and so credentials issued to individuals that often contain PII, personally identifiable data, or personal information, or things that you want to selectively share, and so on. Things given to public entities, to organizations, whether they be private businesses, legal entities, governments, and so on, where the data is public, and you much more care of getting a credential from the holder, proving who they are from a third party. So those are selective disclosure is way less important. Predicates are way less important. Correlatable identifiers are way less important. So anything in organizational data is certainly fine for that, where you're much less concerned about privacy. And so AnonCreds can be used, but they're probably as a base use case not as necessary. So you would use them out of convenience because you already use them for other purposes, but you don't really need to.
Are AnonCreds more computing intensive than W3C credentials?
CL signature certainly is more intensive. We've not seen it to be a particularly large concern in the cases we've come across so far. But that would be definitely a reason for example, moving on to BBS plus signatures as the basis of AnonCreds. And so this is where I like to separate out, AnonCreds from the cryptographic scheme. Other cryptographic schemes can be used, and they will be faster. But at this point, we're not seeing a block in what we're trying to do.
So as you explained earlier in the call, kind of the history of AnonCreds being built and tied to Hyperledger Indy, what does the future of it look like? I think we're starting to see just a lot more separation between different elements. Like at one time, I believe Ursa, Aries, and Indy were kind of one thing as well, and they've all kind of separated. Is it the same path that we're going to see for AnonCreds, being that today there's some dependencies, I guess, on Indy?
Yeah, so what we've been working on for about the last 8 months is taking an OnCreds and creating a specification for it. One of the critiques of an OnCreds has been that it's open source, but there's no specification or there's no standard. So we've been working on that, a specification for it. And in doing that, what we've also discovered is that making an OnCreds independent of Indy, making it ledger agnostic, or more precisely VDR, verifiable data registry agnostic, is a very small step, it turns out. And even more interesting is we found at least 6 different independent entities that have implemented an OnCreds on other than Indy. So it's already happening. I was quite surprised by that. And as I started to ask people around the community, I would hear more and more stories of, oh, we implemented it here. And then there was a Hyperledger presentation where they said, oh, we've implemented an OnCreds, but using Fabric. What that's led to is us wanting to take an OnCreds out of Indy entirely, making it an independent project, including with that the specification. So continuing to evolve a specification that will at some point go to, we hope pretty soon, go to a standard setting organization. And this will make an OnCreds, both from a practical and from a perception viewpoint, as independent of necessarily what ledger it goes on. We do think Indy is a good place to put it on, and we're not saying, Indy isn't a completely valid place, but it turns out that an OnCreds is very independent of where the data is stored. An OnCreds is about processing objects and creating a credential and so on. It's not about where the public objects are stored, and that's been really interesting to find out. So these 2 things that have recently come out, and we're talking the last 3-4 months, of ledger agnostic and OnCreds, and being able to put an OnCreds into a W3C format so that a credential can be shared in W3C format, and a proof, a presentation derived from an OnCreds VCs. We think that really will, combining that with removing an OnCreds entirely from Indy will really open up the interest and allow others to see that they wouldn't be tied to constraints that they don't want to be, and still use, and they can still use an OnCreds. So we think that's great. We're working on that with the Hyperledger Foundation. We think an OnCreds is got a great home at Hyperledger, but we're now moving to the point of it being an independent project decoupled from Indy. And so we're super excited about that. We think that's going to lead to a lot of good things, a lot of contributions.
When you hear someone talk about putting AnonCreds on a ledger like Fabric, because perhaps they're running an existing use case or they're using Fabric for something, when you think about the architecture of this type of system, like, do you still feel like Indy is better suited for just storing the information related to the issuers and the credentials themselves, and you could still interact with another chain within your architecture if you're using Fabric for perhaps for managing assets or stuff like that? Or does it make more sense for it all to sit in one place? I often get these types of questions where people want to do it somewhere, because coming from the blockchain space, it's just, people have a preference of blockchain. That space is extremely tribal. So they want to move everything to their chain. But do you necessarily have to do that, or could you still just leverage Indy, and that system will interact anyways if you're using another chain, just like if you're using another database or whatever other solution?
Yeah, that's exactly basically what we're enabling. Is very similar to DID methods, where you can have your DID wherever you want it. Chances are an entity, an issuer in this case, will choose to use a particular DID and a storage place for that DID. Just like that, just in the same way, an issuer will choose where to route its AnonCreds objects and what ledger or VDR to use. basically now you come back to the verifier, they have to resolve those objects. And so what we're going to come up with is similar to the did methods. Verifiers will want to resolve to certain ledgers or certain ways to resolve an OnCreds objects. And they can use either, local resolvers that are built into their product, or possibly even use a universal resolver to get, for example, an AnonCreds credential definition, which is the thing that contains the public keys for verifying a credential. It will be basically the choice of, issuers where they want to publish their AnonCreds objects, whether that be Ethereum, whether that be, checked.io, which is implemented AnonCreds. They're probably the most advanced at doing a non-Indy AnonCreds ledger. It can be all sorts of places. And then the issuer can choose that. The verifier will think about what credentials they need to consume and where the issuers have placed those credentials. Have placed the objects necessary to access the credentials. I always have to make sure everyone understands the credentials themselves go to the holder. They do not go to any sort of ledger.
Which surprisingly still remains a common misconception. I think when a lot of people are somewhat familiar with the crypto or blockchain space and they get into there, I think everything needs to live on ledger.
Yes, it does not. The credentials themselves do not go on the ledger. Let's be very clear.
Yeah, I'm honestly surprised at just the number of pitches or stuff I hear, and it's just like, wow, it used to be the case maybe in 2015, 2016, doing a lot of blockchain stuff where everyone was playing around and just trying to toss everything on ledger to create their systems. But today it's just, anyways, it still surprises me.
Yeah.
What is the future you see for Hyperledger Indy? So we're seeing a lot of use cases, obviously at the public sector level, where there's some interesting networks and governance around these networks that are spinning up, and Indy seems to be a nice implementation for governments based on just the governance that they could throw into there, and there's just the permissioned aspect. There's also so these are kind of new permissioned networks. There are also other Indy networks that have existed for years, like Sovereign, which is still closed governance, but perhaps it's a little bit more open than, let's say, a government network, where there's not necessarily restrictions around who could be an issuer or what, for example, on the network. There are other Indy-based networks like Indicio, and there's just test networks all over the place. We're seeing even permissioned Indy networks within enterprise use cases. How do you see Indy evolving from here on?
Indy is, we did talk about early on about how AnonCreds encompasses more than just the data model that is in the W3C. It goes beyond that, and as a result makes it very easy for interoperability, much easier than others, because it defines more. And I put that analogy very similar to things like the MDL and ISO, that AnonCreds sort of encapsulates many of the same concerns as MDL. Likewise, Indy provides that same sort of thing. It provides an awful lot of that capability of a permission network focused on identity. So it's very opinionated, and therefore the deployers don't have to be so opinionated. They can go with it. So that's why it's popular. The thought of using blockchains that are based on cryptocurrencies for a government, that's pretty tough. Telling the citizens, hey, we're buying Bitcoin so we can make your identity safe. That's a tough sell. Indy plays that role right now, is not a perfect place to put things, but a whole lot better than a lot of the other options. And so my anticipation is by making AnonCreds independent of Indy, others that previously saw it as Indy specific and closed, sort of proprietary. I don't know where that came from, but for some think think of it as a proprietary system. It's definitely not. Open source, open specification. That will open other options, and now people will say, okay, we're going to use AnonCreds. Now, where are we going to route our AnonCreds? And they're going to look back to Indy solutions. So I sort of look at it as a rising tide floats all boats situation for Indy, where the more use of AnonCreds will also result in more use of Indy, but while leaving open other options and other capabilities to come.
Well, I guess it will result in more use for Indy, but also more use for other anchoring solutions. So it drives more adoption across the board there. And for those that are tribal about specific blockchains because they own tokens or whatever in there, hopefully it'll drive the value for them there as well.
Exactly. Yep. That's exactly right.
If we're not storing any personal identifiable information on chain, and really what is the main property you're looking for, because we're writing schema information, we're writing credential definition information, we're writing information related to the issuers that are tied to these things, is the main property that we're just looking for is the immutability property. And then does it just come down then to what you need to control and what do you not need to control? Because perhaps using Ethereum or using another network, if you don't need to be involved in the governance, is fine. Whereas if you have a public sector network that they need to be involved in the governance, then perhaps Indy is something better. Is that the way you look at it?
Yep, pretty much exactly. I mean, what you're trying to do when you're issuing credentials is you need to publish what amounts to, the core thing, so the public keys themselves, but you're publishing what schema you're using, what the attributes are, and the public keys related to it, and possibly revocation. And that trust and immutability you get from using a ledger supports that use. But where you do it really depends on what you're able to support. I think with Ethereum shifting to proof of stake, it becomes an extremely interesting place. So, I would not be shocked to see something like AnonCreds to use something like SideTree, where you've got a level 2 location for storing these objects and then routing them in Ethereum, because although it's cryptocurrency, at least doesn't raise sustainability questions and energy usage. So that, at least that goes out of the way. So, it just gives you a lot more options. And as you say, control and governance over the network becomes, gives you options, and where that control is needed, where it's critical infrastructure. Having Indy is a great way to go, and doesn't get you involved in cryptocurrencies, but other super scaling ledgers and that become more interesting as well.
Yeah, and even I think another misconception is people, and again, a lot of people coming from blockchain or crypto space feel like they need tons of throughput for transactions without understanding what exactly goes on chain, and that transactions don't involve writing to the chain, which is a misconception.
Yeah,
I hear often still. And perhaps if you don't necessarily need to have control over the governance, maybe a chain like that will just cost less for you to write certain transactions to than to just need to operate and scale an infrastructure yourself. Yeah.
I would note, I'm gonna make a pitch here. Revocation. Revocation in AnonCreds works. We've used it. It is not. It is the weak point of it, and there are other techniques that have come to the fore for using revocation that gives us the same capabilities. That scalability that you talked about there, revocation remains the weak point, and I welcome anyone who's interested in increasing the capabilities of revocation to come talk to us about how to do that and what approaches we've got, because we've got ideas and approaches. We need help from others, contributors, to take that to the next level and make that possible. We want revocation to be much lighter weight, but retain that no correlatable identifier and those capabilities, the ZKP capabilities, the zero knowledge proof capabilities that are there. So anyone who has an interest in expanding the scalability of revocation, please contact, join in with the AnonCreds project that's happening on Hyperledger and learn about how you can contribute to that.
Is revocation in an indie world today done directly on chain? Is there a different registry for it? And then what are the problems that are causing scalability issues? Because there doesn't seem to be scalability issues with how indie is used for, like we're talking about writing specific transactions to it. Like how does the revocation problem differ from that?
With AnonCreds, to create a non-revocable credential type, it's basically 3 objects. It actually could be 2 objects if you're using a common schema. Those are the only things that go on the ledger, and then you can literally issue 1 million, 1 billion credentials without ever altering, without ever writing any more to the ledger. If you use revocation, whenever you revoke credentials in Indy today, you have to write to the ledger to say, oh, these are the credentials that have been revoked. It doesn't say, you don't know whose credentials those are, and a verifier, even if they get a proof of non-revocation, as it's called, from a holder, they won't know in the future. They don't get a correlating identifier, and they don't know in the future whether that person's credential gets revoked or not. So those are good properties. Those are the things we want. The problem is the revocation registries right now are very small on Indy. So if you have 100,000 credentials, which is pretty small, you might have 5 or 10 revocation registries. What we want is to have a revocation registry so that we can issue 1 million credentials and have 1 revocation registry, so that when we revoke 100 of those credentials in a day, we only write 1 transaction to the ledger. So that's the bigger issue right now, is that the revocation registries, the size of them are small, so you have to have many of them. Whereas we would like to scale them up and make them very large. Man, we're getting deep into the weeds. Sorry about that. It is one of my topics, though.
No, I'm sure that listeners appreciate this. I do. In fact, it's been a ton of learning so far for me. So I'm sure the same is true for listeners here. It would be interesting to hear your opinion on the mobile driver's license ISO standard. There's a lot of, if we obviously look at the public sector, there's a lot of push for using this standard for issuing mobile driver's licenses. There's support across different operating systems for this. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people behind these machine readers that are compatible with it that are pushing for it. Does it, just like we were kind of talking about, do W3C format credentials do certain things better or different? Are they better suited for certain use cases than AnonCreds? Could we have the same discussion around MDL? Is MDL better suited for certain use cases, like driver's license, which is the use case it's made for? Or do you feel like AnonCreds is still the way to go for that? How do you kind of look at that landscape?
MDL is at its core driver's license only, and we see the need for many types of credentials. Absolutely, from a government perspective and things that are there, that is one of the core foundational credentials. There's a natural person or a resident credential, and then there's a verified organization credential for a legal entity in a jurisdiction. Those are the two foundational ones. ISO covers one of those, or MDL covers one of those as a possibility. It is tied to the driver's license, so it's very specific to the driver's license, whereas often a natural person needs to do things like prove their age or prove the name that is used with theirs at the government. At the liquor store, you don't need your driver's license per se. It just happens to be a convenient way of sharing it. So once you get into the nuances of broadening out what credentials are and what gets issued, certainly a driver's license seems a very, very specific use case. MDL, so MDL is very precise to that, and as I understand it, some of the big projects that are going on, such as Apple, are very tied to the driver's license use case. The MDL spec has left room for this idea that the MDoc, as it's called, mechanism could be used for other credentials, and maybe there's a path there, although I've heard that there's there may be struggles with that. I don't know enough about it, but the big thing is right now that it is a single purpose credential, so that's very limiting for what you can do with it. As well, it's very tied to vendors deploying it and rules and regulations from those vendors about how and what can be done with it. So that puts a lot of strain on governments. It's basically, there's an article I've seen that talks about the agreement signed between Apple and different states about how, the technical, requirements from Apple on the technical structure within the government organization, the marketing material that can go out and what it should say and things like that. So it's ceding a lot of control for identity from public sector into the private sector, which is, again, quite concerning. So in MDL, that's where that control is very interesting. Let's put it that way. In some ways, it is powerful and it's got lot behind it. On the other hand, it's ceding a lot of control, and that's challenging.
When investing in any technology, you always want to have recourse if you want to go in a different direction with the technology. And I think that is something to consider in the space that we're in as things are continuing to evolve. Do you see a path forward, or what would your recommendation be for governments or states that have gone down the MDL path? Is there a transition path towards AnonCreds or towards something else?
That one I haven't thought of that much, so I don't have a great answer. The general question you ask is exactly what we think about all the time as we're making decisions, which is, starting back in 2019, where Indy was a single stack and included, ideas of how issuers and holders connected, and holders and verifiers. We separated out Aries from that, and we made Aries this layer 2, as you talked about at the trust over IP, so that we had flexibility. And then on top of Aries, we implemented LD, W3C LD signatures and BBS plus. Aries, we think, and the use of DIDCOM and Aries protocols on top of that gives us a ton of flexibility as things evolve going forward. This adjustment to AnonCreds is that same sort of thing. It allows AnonCreds to be separated out so that we're not specifically tied to Indy, but we have options of where we can go. So I think the idea of flexibility is really crucial, and we really think we've got decent flexibility in the hyperledger space with Aries and Indy and AnonCreds that we can mix and match and not be tied, not to have to rewrite our business applications from scratch because one of the Lego blocks doesn't work, that things can be adjusted on the fly and still be able to move forward as the space moves and evolves. And that's the key for flexibility. How that plays in the ISO MPL space, I don't know that one.
It's funny, the Lego block analogy, that's when we had written an article just talking about our experience with Aries, Indy, and different credential formats. That was the image that came to mind, because it felt like things are, they start in one project, but over time they kind of separate from each other. And
yep,
as you were talking, maybe getting their independence is a good a good way of describing all of these projects. But as we move forward, we've talked about the separation from Indy for AnonCreds. What are some of the things that you see on the maybe short term and then longer term roadmap for it?
The short term roadmap is completing the specification. Pulling AnonCreds out of Indy so that we're creating libraries and open source implementations that can be used in a variety of places. So this idea, much as I talked about, this analogy between DID methods, so that there is code for AnonCreds and it calls down to a resolver to either register or retrieve objects. So I think that's the second one is independence. And then the third one that is surprisingly short order is this idea of putting AnonCreds into W3C format, so that whole controversy over, it's not W3C format can simply go away. It's using a different signature, yes, but it's just a W3C format. The other thing that I'm less sure, but I'm very interested in is how AnonCreds can merge and be used with the OIDC space and the OIDC for verifiable credentials. We actually, I host a working group, and this week we had a presentation from some folks in Germany that had taken an Aries framework, ACAPI as it's called, Aries Cloud Agent Python, and had created an integration such that a very lightweight, that an Aries implementation was simply an OIDC provider, and any relying party, any OIDC relying party could call this with an OIDC request that could be converted into a proof request. A proof comes back, and then a JOT, an OIDC response comes back. So that's another one that's I'm very interested in the synergy that'll happen between those two, and the use of AnonCreds in an OIDC space. I think, again, just like you can use AnonCreds in a W3C space, I suspect it can be used in an OIDC JSON Web Token space. There is also the JWP spec, and I don't know enough about it, but I think for readers, JSON Web Proof, I believe it is. I don't know enough about it, but definitely that's on my reading list in the next little while to learn more about, and that could be a little further down the line, but another interesting place.
Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Mathieu Glaude on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.